They erased his name, rewrote his legacy, and buried the truth deep beneath a fortune built on silence, but he came back anyway. This is the story of Graham Whitmore, the forgotten son of a powerful American family who returns after years of exile to confront the lies that shaped his life. What begins as a quiet search for answers turns into a storm of revelations, hidden diaries, falsified legacies, and a mother's final message from beyond the grave. If blood makes you family, then what makes you whole? This time, the truth speaks louder than the name they tried to erase. She called me nothing, not in a whisper, not under her breath. It rang across the dinner table like a bell that cracked crystal. That was a week ago. Tonight, I sat alone in my office, watching dusk press its gray thumb against the window panes while the invitation lay untouched on my desk. Thick, pearlescent paper, edges too sharp, scent too perfumed. Like something bought in bulk and handed out in haste. No handwriting, no warmth, and most notably, no name. Just Miss Emily Whitmore and fiancé cordially invite you to share in their joy. Not dear brother, not even Graham. It wasn't a mistake. My family doesn't make those. I leaned back in the old leather chair, the one Judge Carter gifted me after my first appointment to the bench. The spine of the seat still creaked in that familiar way, reminding me of courtrooms and verdicts, of lines drawn in oak-paneled silence. My office was tidy, framed commendation from the North Carolina Judicial Board on the left, the unopened invitation dead center, and an unopened Navy box pushed just out of reach. I hadn't touched that box in over a decade. Next to the invitation, though, sat a smaller cream card, handwritten. Please don't ruin her day, just stay away. Mom. There it was. Her voice on paper. Still cold, still curt, still incapable of forgiveness. Reread the line until the loops and flourishes blurred. No apology, no explanation, just a plea coded in command. 10 years ago, after I testified in a case that exposed Dad's closest friend for what he truly was, a predator masked in philanthropy, my mother had stood on the porch and said, "We don't air our shame in courtrooms, Graham." She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't looked away. She just closed the door behind her like she was sealing away the family name, with me still outside. That was the last time we spoke face to face. Since then, I'd lived in silence. Not exile, just absence. A silence that didn't scream, didn't rage, but settled over everything like dust on a forgotten shelf. I worked cases I believed in. I kept my reputation clean. I said little. I'd buried more, but the blank invitation wasn't silence. It was erasure. My hand drifted to the Navy box. The brass hinge resisted, then gave way with a soft click. Inside, the velvet still cradled the judicial pin Judge Carter had handed me. "This is more than a symbol," he'd said that day. "It's a promise you make every time you wear it, to tell the truth even when no one wants to hear it." I hadn't worn it since the ethics tribunal, since the newspapers called me reckless and my family called me embarrassment. I set the pin gently in the center of the desk. Then I opened my laptop. Matthew Green, law firm, Asheville. I hit enter. His name popped up in 3 seconds flat. Civil rights attorney, featured speaker, op-eds in National Journal. One headline stood out. "We the people still means us." I clicked. Midway through the article, my breath caught. Justice isn't the loudest gavel in the room. It's the one that leaves space for someone else's silence. Honogram, Graham Whitmore, State v. Lindstrom, 2011. I remembered that ruling, a housing rights case. Tenants about to be evicted after a shady rezoning deal. I had written that line to defend the woman who refused to speak in court because she feared retaliation. And now here it was, quoted by a stranger, by my sister's fiancé. He didn't even know I'd be sitting in that audience. But I would be. They left my name off the invitation, so I would write it back in with presence. The drive to Asheville was quieter than I expected. just the hum of tires against highway and the occasional flick of the turn signal. The fall leaves had begun their slow surrender. Rusty orange, dull gold, the kind of palette that made people nostalgic for a version of the South that never really existed, the kind my mother used to display on greeting cards we never sent. I arrived at the vineyard an hour before the rehearsal dinner, not because I was early, but because I needed to see the place in its undressed form, before the candlelight and champagne blurred the outlines of truth. The venue was polished, picture-perfect, a converted winery with sweeping views of Blue Ridge valleys, white chairs aligned in militant symmetry, and centerpieces arranged like curated apologies. The staff eyed me as they walked past. Pressed black vests, polite smiles, the kind that flickered when they didn't recognize your face but felt they probably should. I found the seating chart near the entrance. Names in delicate calligraphy curled over ivory cards. Emily's name was everywhere, assigned to speeches, table leads, spotlight timings. My name was nowhere, but I found it anyway. Near the back, table 8, a blank tent card, folded, pressed, left beside polished silverware and an untouched linen napkin. It was a placeholder, not an invitation. I took the seat. Across the vineyard, guests trickled in. Suits too tight, heels too high, laughter rehearsed to the pitch of champagne. A few glanced my way, then politely dismissed me with narrowed brows and nervous smiles, like I was an unfamiliar relative from a branch too thorny to trace. Matthew arrived last. Clean-cut, steady, the kind of man who read the fine print and remembered the bartender's name. His eyes swept the space with practiced ease until they met mine. He paused. Not long enough to make a scene, just long enough to register recognition. Then he smiled, just slightly. Emily, on the other hand, moved like she was floating, graceful, polished, southern charm wrapped in designer silk. She worked the room like a hostess who'd been coached since birth, touching elbows, offering delicate laughs, her voice soft enough to disarm, but firm enough to dismiss. She didn't look at me, not once. Dinner began with an orchestral version of some pop song I didn't recognize. Appetizers arrived like clockwork, tiny portions on oversized plates. I wasn't hungry, but I ate anyway. It felt necessary somehow, like marking time. Then came the toasts. Emily's college roommate spoke first, something about late-night study sessions and loyalty. Her voice cracked once, rehearsed to perfection. Then Aunt Jean, who always cried before she spoke, stood and offered a rambling tribute to family ties and forgiveness. I almost laughed. And then Matthew rose, his napkin folded beside his plate, his speech tucked neatly in his inside pocket. He didn't look at Emily as he began. "I didn't grow up with a strong male role model," he said, "but in law school, there was a ruling I couldn't stop thinking about. Tenant rights, systemic bias, clarity and courage in the same paragraph." The room shifted. Forks paused. The ruling was written by a judge named Graham Whitmore. I didn't blink. Emily did, her spine locked in place. Matthew's gaze found me again. I didn't know then what I know now, that the man who wrote those words would be sitting at my wedding, not just as a guest, but as a reason I kept going. The air thickened. I set my glass down. Across the table, a cousin lowered her eyes. Somewhere to my right, a champagne flute tipped. Emily stood, her voice cut through the hum like broken glass. "He's nothing. He's nobody." And just like that, the silence made room for the truth. I woke before dawn, not because of nerves, those had long since burned out, but because silence had a way of tugging me from sleep before the light ever did. Outside, the fog was stitched tight against the hills of Asheville, muffling the edges of everything. I stood by the window in my rented room, watching the vineyard house disappear and reappear in swirls of gray. Somewhere beyond the trees, the Whitmore family stirred in rooms I would never again be invited to enter. Last night had not gone unnoticed. The headlines hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel them forming in whispers. I could still see Emily's fingers trembling against the stem of her glass, still hear her voice fracture under the weight of a truth she'd worked years to bury. But it wasn't her reaction that kept echoing in my mind. It was Matthew's. The way he'd said my name like it mattered, like it still belonged to me. I showered, dressed, and skipped breakfast. Hunger had been replaced by purpose, and that was always the stronger fuel. I drove into town, the streets still wet from the night's rain. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for yet, only that I wasn't leaving until I found it. Downtown Asheville was waking up slowly. A bookstore unlocked its doors, a street musician tuned his guitar, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from a bakery I used to visit when I was still in law school. Back then, I believed in systems. I believed that if you followed the rules and held the truth tightly enough, people would have no choice but to hear it. I knew better now. I parked beside a small legal office, green, Porter, and Vale, Matthew's firm. I didn't go in, not yet. Instead, I sat across the street, watching the front entrance as if it might offer answers by osmosis. After a few minutes, the door opened. A woman in her 30s stepped out, holding a to-go coffee tray and a stack of files. She glanced both ways, then headed toward the parking lot. I recognized her from last night. She'd sat near Matthew at the head table. Probably a paralegal or junior associate. I waited until she drove off, then crossed the street and stepped inside. The receptionist looked up, surprised. "I'm here to see Matthew Green," I said, voice even. "Tell him it's Judge Whitmore." She hesitated, fingers hovering over the phone, unsure whether to announce me or call security. Eventually, she chose the phone. Moments later, Matthew emerged from a side hallway, no tie, sleeves rolled up, eyes alert. "Judge Whitmore," he said, offering a firm handshake. "Didn't expect to see you today." "I didn't expect to be here," I replied. "But here we are." He gestured to a conference room. No small talk, no scripts. The air between us was professional but charged, like two people who knew too much about truth to waste it on pleasantries. "I imagine Emily's not thrilled," he said once we sat. "She's had 10 years to erase me. One night shouldn't shake her this much, unless she's afraid of something else." Matthew didn't answer immediately. Then he opened a drawer, pulled out a file, and slid it across the table. "I was going to wait until after the wedding, but I think you deserve to see this now." I opened it. Inside were scanned letters, handwritten notes, and a name I hadn't seen in years. Nathan Hale. It landed like a stone in my chest. Matthew leaned forward. "That name means something to you." I didn't respond. Not yet. I was too busy watching a part of my history unravel across a page that hadn't been meant for me. I stared at the file, its pages trembling slightly in my hand, though the room was still. Nathan Hale. The name wasn't unfamiliar, but it belonged to the past. A past that had been shuttered and sealed long before I understood the consequences of opening certain doors. He had been around when I was a boy, a man with quiet eyes and a laugh that never quite reached them. I remember him more by presence than detail, like the feeling of a room holding its breath. He disappeared when I was 8. No explanation. One day he was at our dinner table, offering to fix the garage door with my father. The next, gone. I had asked my mother where he went. She'd only replied, "Not everyone is meant to stay." But now his name was here, printed, inked, preserved in the yellowing edges of a private record. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Matthew folded his hands. "After I mentioned your ruling in one of my lectures last year, someone sent me a packet. No return address, but it was postmarked from Raleigh. It had your name, a few legal articles, and those pages." He leaned in. "You're not just connected to Emily's past, Judge. You're tethered to something she's tried very hard to forget." I felt the heat in my chest rise. Slow, quiet, like a furnace being stoked. The pages included a draft birth certificate, with Nathan Hale listed as the legal father, later amended in handwriting to reflect William Whitmore, my supposed father. There was no official seal, just notations and initials in black ink, but the original line was clear and crossed out with deliberate pressure. I'd seen redactions before. This wasn't bureaucratic. This was personal. "You're saying someone sent this anonymously?" Matthew nodded. "It came with a note. One line." He pulled a small envelope from the back of the file and passed it over. I opened it and read, "Blood never lies, but families do." I sat back, the paper loose in my fingers. In the legal world, we often say evidence speaks for itself, but sometimes it whispers. And in those whispers, entire histories can be rewritten. I placed the envelope back down and looked at Matthew. "Make you a good friend when this team gets stable." He shrugged slightly. "Because if someone tried to erase you, I figured you know what to do with a name that refuses to stay buried." His words hit harder than I expected. I left the office with the file under my arm and a cold wind pressing against the back of my neck, like a warning. That evening, I drove out of town, not toward the hotel, but toward the edge of Asheville, toward a house I hadn't seen in years. The Whitmore estate stood like a monument to curated legacy, painted white shutters, fresh landscaping, and that same damn iron gate that always squeaked when you opened it. No one was home. I knew the back fence still had the latch I once used to sneak out for moot court practice. It still worked. I walked across the patio, avoiding the lights. Every step was a memory. The swing my mother hated, the rose bushes my father trimmed every Sunday, the window I once broke and blamed on a tree branch, and then the basement door, still locked, but not for long. I ran my fingers along the stone ledge where the spare key used to hide. To my surprise, it was still there. Same rusted brass, same chipped paint. The door creaked open. The air was heavy with dust and something else, something older. I flicked the switch. The light blinked twice before holding. There against the far wall was an old metal filing cabinet, scratched, padlocked, and taped to the front a yellowed piece of paper with my name, G. Whitmore, written in pen. Whoever had tried to erase me had forgotten to finish the job. By sunrise, my name was already in the headlines, but not the way it had been the night before, spoken aloud in a room that never expected me. This time it came wrapped in conjecture and digital venom. My phone buzzed endlessly, vibrating across the counter of the motel's kitchenette like a trapped insect. I let it rattle. I didn't need to read the alerts. I knew how this worked. They couldn't deny I existed anymore, so they rewrote the reason I did. Judge Graham Whitmore resurfaces at sister's wedding amid scandal rumors. Once estranged brother sparks controversy at prominent Asheville event. Anonymous sources raise questions about past judicial misconduct. The timing was surgical. Less than 12 hours after the dinner. Someone had been waiting. I finally silenced the phone and walked to the window. The fog had lifted, but the clouds hung low like an unfinished sentence. I sipped lukewarm coffee and stared at the screen one last time. The worst one wasn't even an article. It was a Reddit thread. What did Judge Whitmore really do? The top comment, "No one gets erased from a family that wealthy unless there's more to the story." It wasn't the lie that stung. It was the ease with which people chose to believe it. I called Maya. She picked up on the first ring, voice already taut with caffeine and fire. "I saw it," she said. "Not subtle," I replied. Went for volume, not quality. 5 outlets, 3 with recycled rumors from the tribunal. Nothing new, nothing verifiable. "They don't need truth, just traction." There was a pause on the line. Then her voice dropped. "What do you want to do?" I stared at the file from yesterday. Nathan Hale's name still burned into my brain. "We answer," I said, not with outrage, with evidence. Maya didn't ask for more. She never did. Give me 2 hours. I'll draft a release, attach the judicial review letter, the Innocence Project commendation, and the fact checks from your ethics case. No hashtags, no quotes. Just truth. Quiet truth, I said, the loudest kind. By mid-morning, Maya uploaded the release to the courthouse transparency portal. No dramatic tweets, no press conferences, just a clear, factual statement backed by documentation no rumor mill could spin. And then the shift began. It started in the comment sections, buried at first, then rising. Judge Whitmore handled my housing case when I was broke and scared. He treated me like a person, not a problem. He came to my dad's funeral when no one else from the city showed. He didn't need to speak last night. Just being there said enough. The posts weren't orchestrated. They came from all over. Former clients, old law clerks, people I hadn't thought about in years. Not a single one used the word hero, but each one rebuilt a brick I thought had been lost. One stood out. A man I remembered sentencing. He gave me 5 years, but he looked me in the eye when he did, told me I could do better. I believed him. I'm a counselor now. I sat still for a long time after that, not because I doubted the truth, but because I'd forgotten how many people it had quietly reached. For the first time in years, I wasn't defending my name. I was watching it rise on its own. By the afternoon, the noise had shifted. What started as a smear campaign was unraveling, undone not by outrage but by memory, real memory, the kind built in courtrooms, not cocktail parties. I stepped outside the motel, the late-day sun warming the back of my neck. Asheville looked the same. But for the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like a ghost passing through it. I crossed the street toward a small cafe I used to frequent during my early years on the circuit court, back when no one knew my name, and I still thought truth alone could hold up a broken system. Inside, the place hadn't changed. Same cracked leather booths, same smell of burnt espresso. I sat in the back corner, not out of caution, but habit. I ordered coffee, black, no sugar. The waitress didn't recognize me, which was perfect. My laptop pinged. An email from Maya. Subject: thought you'd like this. Attachment: audio clip, transcript optional. I plugged in my earbuds and hit play. A female voice, quiet but firm. Judge Whitmore's ruling in Thompson v. Linford made it possible for my client to stay in her home. It also made it possible for me to stay in law school. I owe him more than I can say. The voice belonged to Claire Saunders, a young public defender out of Charlotte. We'd never met. But I remembered the Thompson case. A landlord had tried to evict a disabled tenant with 72 hours notice, claiming a family emergency clause that didn't exist. My decision to stay the eviction and cite ADA protections was met with silence from the press, but apparently not from her. I smiled without meaning to. Then another ping. A second email. No sender name, just a string of numbers. The subject line: not all of them are lying, but some know more than they said. Attached was a photo. The Whitmore family portrait. The original version. Before the crop. I stared at it, heart suddenly louder than the cafe around me. It was taken 10 years ago at Emily's graduation. I remembered the setting. The back lawn of our estate, sun casting long shadows, everyone dressed in coordinated tones like we were auditioning for a catalog. I had stood behind Emily, hand on her shoulder, smiling because you show up even if they don't want you there. But the photo that made it online had sliced me out, a digital amputation, a piece of memory deliberately erased. This one was intact, and someone wanted me to know it. I flipped the photo over. No note, no handwriting, just a printed timestamp and one line typed near the bottom corner. The truth is never missing, just misplaced. I left the cafe without finishing my coffee. I had seen enough. Back at the motel, I opened the navy box again. The judicial pin sat in its velvet cradle, still gleaming despite the years. I pinned it to the inside of my jacket, not on the lapel, not for anyone to see, just close enough to feel its weight. Then I opened a blank document on my laptop. At the top, I typed a name I hadn't written in years, Nathan Hale, then beneath it, Raleigh, 1991. Whitmore Estate Maintenance Ledger, Employee ID, NH247B. I didn't know what I was building yet. A case, a reckoning. A reckoning without a courtroom. But something had shifted, and this time, I wasn't going to wait for permission to be heard. The wedding ceremony was arranged in a circle, like a soft-spoken theater in the middle of curated nature. Each seat was wrapped in ivory linen, tied with a pale eucalyptus sprig and a handwritten name tag. Except for one. The chair farthest from the aisle, beneath the canopy of a birch tree, held only a folded napkin. No name, no claim, just a placeholder for someone they hoped wouldn't show. I sat anyway. The garden was drenched in gold light, the kind that made even lies look lovely. Photographers floated between floral arches and champagne towers, snapping shots of curated joy. A quartet played softly from behind a hedge, and guests murmured pleasantries through perfect smiles, their attention darting just long enough to notice me, then darting away. Matthew stood near the altar, hands folded calmly, like he wasn't about to marry into a family that had declared me invisible. Emily arrived moments later, all lace and structure, her hair pinned into stillness. She didn't look at me, but she paused as she passed, the corner of her mouth twitching, not from nerves, but calculation. I'd seen that expression before, on her mother. Linda sat in the front row, posture rigid, eyes glazed in serenity like a glass shield. She wore a pearl brooch I hadn't seen since my father's funeral, and the same smile she wore then. Tight, polite, empty. The officiant began. We gather today to celebrate a union, a legacy, and the love that built both. Legacy, that word settled hard in my chest. He started naming those who helped plan the day. Aunt Ruth, Cousin Jared, Emily's dear college roommate, and of course Linda Whitmore, the ever-gracious matriarch. My name was not spoken, not even skipped, just omitted so smoothly it was surgical. But it wasn't silence, it was strategy. The vows were brief, flawless. Matthew read his from a folded page. Emily spoke hers without cue cards, perfectly modulated. It was less a declaration than a broadcast, and when the kiss came, polite applause followed, quick and composed, like checking a box. Then the toasts began. We moved to the reception lawn, where a long table awaited under strung lights. Candles flickered inside hurricane glasses, and rose petals trailed between place settings. My seat had been preserved, same blank card, same distance from the center. People avoided eye contact as they passed. Some nodded. Some pretended to be looking elsewhere. It didn't matter. I wasn't there for them. Matthew stood, holding his glass. I want to thank you all, he began, voice steady. Some of you have shaped who Emily and I are today. Others shaped who we had to become to get here. He looked around the table. His eyes paused when they met mine. There's someone here tonight who taught me before I ever passed the bar that the law isn't about power, it's about presence, that courage isn't always loud, and truth doesn't always come with applause. The guests stilled. Matthew's voice never wavered. I wouldn't be standing here today if I hadn't read his ruling in State v. Lindstrom, a ruling that reminded me people matter more than procedure. So wherever you're seated. Judge Graham Whitmore, thank you. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sharp, like everyone had stepped onto something fragile and didn't dare move. Emily didn't look at me, but her fingers tightened around her wine glass until her knuckles paled. I didn't smile. I didn't bow my head. I simply raised my glass in Matthew's direction. And for the first time that day, I felt myself return to the room. Not because they let me in, but because someone remembered where I had always been. Emily didn't storm out this time. She stood, composed, rigid like porcelain balanced on the edge of a mantel. Her smile was frozen, eyes fixed ahead, but her body betrayed her. A slight tremble in her left hand, the way her jaw locked after every sip of wine. She was unraveling slowly, the way silk tears under steady pressure. Dinner continued around us like nothing had happened. Plates clinked, glasses refilled, laughter picked up in cautious bursts. Someone attempted a joke about wedding registries and returns. It didn't land. Even the music, soft jazz drifting from concealed speakers, seemed to hesitate between tracks. I kept my gaze low, letting the weight of Matthew's words settle. He hadn't spoken them for show. I could see it in his eyes. He meant it, and that truth, spoken in front of them all, had done what a decade of silence never could. It cracked the varnish. A few guests began to look at me differently. Not like a scandal waiting to reappear, but like a page they'd forgotten to finish reading. Then Emily moved. Without a word, she stepped away from the head table, her heels silent on the grass. The photographers instinctively backed off. She walked past the floral arch, past the candlelit paths, directly toward my end of the table. I didn't rise. She stopped beside me, one hand resting on the back of my chair, the other clutching a small white envelope. No expression, no words. She reached forward and laid it gently on my plate. Then she walked away, not back to Matthew, not to her mother, toward the estate's side gate, disappearing behind a veil of eucalyptus and string lights. I stared at the envelope, the weight of it, the finality. It was unsealed. Inside, there was no letter, just a photograph. At first it looked familiar. My father's 60th birthday. A long banquet table, outdoor lights above, cake slightly off-center. In the original, I had been standing at the far edge, hand on my mother's shoulder. That version, of course, had been edited, posted without me, archived without acknowledgement. But this was the original, uncropped, untouched. I was there. Not added later, not airbrushed in, just there, as I had always been. Someone had kept it. I flipped the photo over. In faint pencil near the bottom corner were 3 words, written in Emily's script. Not cursive, just block letters. You were right. That night I left the reception without another word. No one stopped me. No one followed. Back at my motel, I laid the photo beside Judge Carter's letter and the Nathan Hale file. 3 anchors. 3 fragments of a past I no longer needed to prove. Had been there, even when they tried to pretend I hadn't. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet tick of the wall clock and the distant hum of passing cars. Then came the sound that didn't belong, a soft knock at the door. I opened it. No one stood there, only a small padded envelope at my feet. Inside, a cassette tape, old, label faded, but scrawled across the front, in the same pen as before, were 2 words. The silence wasn't finished speaking. The cassette tape sat on the desk like a ghost. No return address, no explanation. Just the basement, scrawled in smudged ink across its label. I hadn't seen a cassette player in years, but I found one in a second-hand electronics store off Patton Avenue. The owner didn't ask questions, just slid the dusty player across the counter with a grunt and a nod. Back at the motel, I fed the tape into the machine and pressed play. At first, only static. Then, a thud. Footsteps. A woman's voice. My mother's. Younger. Sharper. You think no one will find out? That Graham won't start asking questions? A pause. Then my father's voice. Calm. Controlled. He won't. He doesn't even know what to look for. Something shifted in the background. A chair scraping, perhaps. Then her voice again, brittle with panic. He looks like Nathan. Don't pretend you haven't noticed. Silence. Long and bitter. "Don't say his name in this house," my father said finally. But the damage was done. I sat frozen, breath shallow. The tape continued with indistinct murmurs, the occasional clatter, and finally the soft click of someone stopping the recording. I rewound it, played it again and again. There it was, in her own voice, not rumor, not suspicion. My mother had said it, out loud, on record. "He looks like Nathan Hale," and suddenly the fragments aligned. The amended birth certificate, the erased family photos, the hushed exit Nathan made from our lives when I was still learning multiplication tables. My childhood hadn't been built on silence. It had been built on a lie. The next morning, I didn't call Maya. I didn't need a press strategy or a legal briefing. What I needed was buried somewhere beneath years of dust and polished deception. I drove to the Whitmore estate. It looked exactly the same. Manicured, symmetrical, sterile, the kind of house that photographed well from any angle because nothing human had been allowed to grow wild there in decades. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest on foot. It was early enough that the staff hadn't arrived. The gate, to my surprise, was unlocked. Old habits. Or someone had left it open for me. The back door was bolted, but I didn't need it. The basement entrance was around the side, beneath the kitchen patio. Years ago, I'd hidden under that deck with a flashlight and a paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, avoiding chores and pretending I was invisible. Now I was back, not invisible, but ignored. Something far more dangerous. The rusted key I'd retrieved earlier turned with resistance. The door groaned open like a reluctant confession. The air hit me first, musty and metallic, the scent of memory and metal. I descended slowly, each step pressing dust into wood that hadn't creaked in years. The basement was as I remembered. Concrete walls, old boxes, a washer that had long since stopped working. But in the far corner behind a stack of crates and forgotten trophies stood the old filing cabinet, and taped to the top drawer, faded but legible, was a yellowing sheet of paper. G.W.H. Moore. Do not discard. I stared at it, pulse steady but heavy. Then I reached for the drawer. The padlock was intact but weak. One twist with an old wrench from the workbench and it snapped. Inside, a sealed manila envelope labeled Hale Private, and beneath it, a birth certificate, mine, with Nathan Hale's name typed in the father field, not crossed out, not amended, just there, waiting to be seen. The envelope was thick, sealed with brittle adhesive and the weight of decades. I sat on the floor, cross-legged like a child, and opened it with the same hands that had once built Lego castles on this very concrete. Inside I found records I'd never seen, some printed, some handwritten. There was a letter, dated July 14, 1996, addressed to my mother, from Nathan Hale. Eleanor, I don't know what to believe anymore. But if you decide to tell Graham, he deserves to know it wasn't because I didn't love him. It was because I wasn't allowed to. My breath caught. I turned the page. Gregory threatened me. Said he'd destroy you in court if I tried to file for paternal rights. Said the boy would never know peace. I chose to disappear because I thought it would keep you both safe. I thought maybe pretending I didn't exist was a way of loving him. The handwriting faltered near the end. There was no signature, only initials. I looked down at the envelope again, as if it might suddenly close itself, return to the drawer and make this all go away. But it didn't. And I didn't want it to. Because this wasn't just proof. It was truth. I gathered every paper inside and photographed them. Then I slid the envelope into my bag, replaced the drawer's contents, and closed the cabinet as if tucking away the final chapter of someone else's lie. Upstairs, the house remained silent, sunlight stretching through the windows like it was trying to reach me. But it couldn't. Not really, because I wasn't that boy anymore. I was the man who had just unlocked his entire origin story in a basement. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard a sound that froze me mid-step, a voice. "Graham?" I turned. Judith, my mother's old friend, my godmother, in theory. Her white hair was pulled into a low chignon, her coat still speckled with morning frost. She didn't look shocked to see me. "Still leave the basement door open, huh?" I said quietly. She didn't smile. She looked at the bag in my hand, then at me. "So? You finally found it?" "You knew?" I asked. Her silence was louder than any confession. "How long?" I pressed. "Since before your mother passed," she said. "She made me promise not to interfere, but she also made me promise that, if you ever came looking, I wouldn't stop you." "So that's it?" I asked. "You stood by while Gregory pretended I was his. I stood by while your mother tried to survive a man who controlled everything," she said. Her voice cracked, not with guilt, but weariness. "You think it was easy for her? For any of us?" I stepped past her, barely touching her shoulder. "Easy isn't the word I'm worried about," I muttered. "Truth is." She didn't follow. I left the house through the front door for the first time in years. It felt right. Outside, the air was sharper, cleaner. The wind pressed against my jacket like it recognized me. I got into my rental car and placed the envelope on the passenger seat, next to a thermos of cold coffee and the printed invitation to Emily's wedding reception. This time, I wouldn't be attending as an outsider. This time, I had something to say. I started the engine, glancing once more at the envelope. Nathan Hale, my father. The man whose name had been hidden from me my entire life. The man I would find, because now I wasn't just reclaiming my past. I was about to rewrite our family's entire history. The New Mexico sun was relentless, baking the clay rooftops and casting long gold shadows across the desert sprawl. I pulled into a dirt driveway marked only by a faded wooden sign, Hale & Sons Auto Restoration since 1982. It looked like time had forgotten the place, or maybe it had been deliberately hidden. Just like the name I now carried in my chest like a pulse. The man in the doorway wore a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, forearms inked with faded grease and life. He watched me like he knew I didn't belong here, but not in the way strangers do. In the way someone recognizes a ripple from a stone thrown decades ago. "You're looking for Nathan?" he asked. I nodded, stepping out of the car. "I think I might be." The man didn't move. "Who sent you?" "No one," I said. "I found him." His jaw tightened. "And who are you?" I paused, not because I didn't know, but because for the first time in my life, I was about to say it on purpose. "My name is Graham Whitmore," I said slowly, "but I think I'm your son." He didn't flinch. Not a gasp, not even a twitch of disbelief, just silence that stretched so thin I could hear the hum of cicadas in the distance. He looked down at the ground, then back at me. "You look like her." My breath caught. "You knew?" "I always knew," he said, stepping off the porch. "But your mother made me promise to stay away. Said it would protect you." I didn't agree, but I respected her choice. I stared at him. There was no righteous anger in my chest, no dramatic confrontation, just this strange, unfamiliar gravity pulling me toward a truth that felt warmer than anything I'd known in the Whitmore estate. We sat down on a bench under a rusted awning. He poured 2 glasses of iced tea. No words, just hands used to building things that last. "She said you were dead," I whispered. He shook his head. "No, son. I was erased. There's a difference." The word erased echoed in my mind. It wasn't just him. It had been me, too. "I found your letters," I said. "The ones you wrote to Mom, and a copy of the birth certificate hidden in the basement." He didn't ask why it had been hidden. He knew. He'd lived the cost of silence. Nathan took a folded paper from his back pocket and slid it across to me. A DNA report, verified, signed, my name and his, side by side, not just in blood, but in ink. I had it done after you left the Whitmore home, he said. Judith told me. She sent me an old photo. I needed to be sure. I picked up the paper with trembling fingers. It wasn't just data, it was belonging. Thank you, I murmured. For what? He asked. For not pretending, I said. Everyone else in that family, they kept choosing the lie. He nodded, swallowing hard. You came here looking for answers, but what do you want next? I looked past the fence, into the horizon. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's legacy. I was standing in my own. I want to build something different, I said, with my name, not theirs. Nathan smiled faintly. Then you've already started. We sat in silence, the kind that doesn't ache anymore. Behind us, the old garage buzzed to life as one of his employees rolled a car into the sun. It gleamed like it had been reborn, and I realized, so had I. 2 weeks later, I stood before the Whitmore estate one last time, not as a castaway son or a forgotten name in someone else's legacy, but as a man who had returned, uncovered, and now chose what to carry forward. The grand oak doors loomed ahead, closed like they always had been to anyone who didn't fall in line. But today wasn't about them anymore. They entered not for confrontation, but for closure. Judith sat at the long dining table, posture perfect as always, eyes unreadable. Marcus stood behind her, his hands clasped, like a guard still unsure who he was protecting. Neither said a word as I placed a manila envelope in front of them. Inside, a notarized document relinquishing any claim to the Whitmore fortune, the estate, the businesses. I didn't want a single dollar, not anymore. What is this? Judith finally asked, her voice brittle. My freedom, I said. Yours too, maybe. She glanced at Marcus, then back at me. So you're just walking away? No, I replied. I already walked away the day I found out the truth. Today, I'm letting go. There was no vindictive satisfaction in her eyes, only something tired, something that almost resembled relief. As I turned to leave, Judith spoke again, more quietly this time. You were always stronger than we gave you credit for, Graham. I paused at the doorway. I know. That night, I stood under the wide New Mexico sky, email open on my laptop. A message had just arrived, from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "She didn't tell you everything." My stomach tightened. I clicked it open. Attached was a scanned letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. If you're reading this, Graham, then you've found Nathan, and I'm gone. I've left you all the clues I could, but there's one more truth you deserve to know. The man who raised me, Victor Whitmore, was not only your he was also the one who forced me into silence, threatening Nathan and myself. There's a journal. I hid it behind the baseboard in my bedroom closet. If you want to finish this story, not just yours, but mine, you know where to look. I stared at the screen. The desert air still and charged. My mother had left one last breadcrumb, one final vault of truth buried in that house, not for revenge, but for liberation. Hers and mine. The next morning I returned to the estate with one purpose, not to reclaim, but to retrieve. The room hadn't changed. My mother's perfume still faintly lingered in the walls. I pried open the old baseboard, heart pounding. Behind it, wrapped in linen, was a leather-bound journal with initials embossed in gold. E.W. I didn't open it there. I waited until I was miles away, back in Santa Fe. Sunlight filtering through the windows of a small coffee shop where no one knew my name. And when I did, I didn't cry. I just read. Page after page of a woman who had fought silently for me, who had tried to carve out a future in a world that punished her for loving the wrong man, for choosing truth over inheritance. Later that week, I spoke at a local college in Albuquerque, invited by Professor Maya Quinn, an old contact of my mother's who had read one of my op-eds. The auditorium was modest, the students curious. I told them the story, not of bloodlines or betrayal, but of choosing your own name when the one you were given was soaked in silence. I told them how freedom sometimes meant surrendering the throne you never asked for just to build something real with your own hands. And as I stepped down from the podium, someone pressed a note into my palm. Just 4 words, handwritten in pencil. Truth needs a witness. I looked around. No one met my eye. But I smiled anyway. Because maybe now, finally, someone had heard. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of silence, truth, and redemption. The Blood That Built Me is not just a story about uncovering secrets. It's about reclaiming the voice they tried to erase. To everyone who has ever felt like the outsider in their own family, this story is for you. If it moved you, if it reminded you of something unspoken in your past, we hope it also gave you courage. Because sometimes, walking away isn't weakness, it's the beginning of becoming whole. See you in the next chapter.